Hello, everybody. My name's Matthew. At a young age, I found fascination within all things tech, ultimately how computers work, and then further how we can manipulate them to achieve unintended behavior. Comparing myself to the previous speaker, Jonathan, I'm also from Joburg, moved to the Western Cape. Unlike Jonathan, I got my degree in dropping out of high school. And I'll never move back to this place ever again. So yeah, I also have the privilege to say that I've been working with Orange Cyber Defense as a security analyst for 2 years now. We live in a time where information is available to any of us with internet access. You're not sure what to make for dinner, you Google it. You want to know what recipe is in a different language, you Google it, right? All this information is just locked behind a search bar, which is quite the privilege, but it's also something that humans have built quite a big dependency on as well. Platforms like social media, forums, and credible news sources, paired with the likelihood of someone just stumbling across it and mindlessly consuming that and then not questioning it whatsoever, is a breeding ground for spread of misinformation. This makes it very essential for us to manually validate what we come across. But furthermore, we should also be very cautious over what we post online. So, for example, here we have someone who's posted that they're going to Bali for a holiday. This by itself is really not that bad. In this photo, they also add their flight or airline and their seat number, which is a little bit worse, but still not that bad. I mean, not much we can do with that information. However, with their next post, they have added their tickets. This obviously has their full names, their seat numbers, flight numbers as well, and which is what I would consider obviously oversharing. So when no one's really needing to be doing that. In this talk, I'll be sharing my journey with geolocation, and the cool things that I've learned from it. So we'll start off the journey with a browser game that is more than meets the eye. We'll then cover image analysis, where we will learn about the fundamentals, what to look out for, and then how this led to the thought of using AI to geolocate an image. Big thought. We then dive into geolocation and chronolocation, where we will hunt down some graffiti tags. We will also validate an image that was sent to us, claiming that it was from a specific country. And then we'll also find out when an image was taken by turning an object into a sundial. And then I'll end it off with some key takeaways, and then how these skills can be used for good. Cool. So, as mentioned before, in this section, I'll be covering where it all began, as well as some useful and not so useful indications that we can learn from a browser game. So, scientifically speaking, it all started with the Big Bang. But obviously, this isn't about the Big Bang, but more metaphorically speaking, it's about my Big Bang within geolocation, which would be GeoGuessr. GeoGuessr was launched in 2013 by some Swedish dude. It went viral after its launch, but interest soon died out. This was until 2020. Remember the pandemic. Honestly, I don't blame anyone for shoving as much memories away as possible from that time. But thanks to everyone being forced to stay at home, this gave content creators a new game to play, and ultimately brought a new audience, including myself, to the game. It's just a browser game where you get dropped into a random location in the world, with the end goal being to essentially locate yourself. The closer you are, the more points you get. Simple premise or simple idea, but it's a pretty great place to start when building the fundamentals for geolocation. While there are a ton of useful indications that we can learn from this game, it's also just a game that strictly uses Google Street View. So with that comes specific tells of where you may be in the world, and these are referred to as metas. So some examples of these metas would be how to identify which hemisphere you're in. So if the sun's sitting more to the south, you'll be in the northern hemisphere. You can also find this out with shadows. So if the shadow is laying in the south, that means the sun is coming from the north. It will always be perpendicular to a shadow. And then if it's in the north, you're in the southern hemisphere. Then we know that we're in Ghana, just because the Google car has those 2 bars on, but a single piece of back tape. And then we know that we're in a specific state within Brazil, thanks to the piranha pine, which is an endangered species that is only most commonly found in the state of Piranha. Then we know that we're in Aberdeen, Scotland, by the grey granite used for the buildings. Majority of the buildings in this town actually use that granite, and this is because of the increased demand in the 18th century. And then there's knowing you're in Sibiu, Romania, because of the eye-like windows in the roofs. This is fairly common in the city, and as far as I know, completely unique to it. And then there's knowing which region in Poland you're in, based off of just what if a village name ends in O or wo. That's not how you pronounce it, but I'm not Polish, so sorry. What's interesting is though you can kind of see a literal border between the two, which is odd. And then lastly, you're able to tell if you're in Japan and or Switzerland, just because of the height of the camera. So in Switzerland and Japan, if it sits a little bit more at like eye level, and in the rest of the world, it kind of sits above your head so you can look down on someone's head. So to show this example, we have Switzerland, and then we have Germany. Cool. So the more I played GeoGuessr, the more I started picking up on vague resemblances it has to pen testing. I like to sort of look at these metas as vulnerabilities, and we can exploit them by pinpointing where we are in the world. But as we've seen with the Ghana and the Switzerland example, it's only strictly valid to Google Street View. So while metas like those are useful for getting as much points as possible, it doesn't really translate well into geolocating outside of Google Street View. GeoHints and Plunkett are awesome resources for this. Essentially, if you want to just have a bit of a deep dive as to how you can identify where you are in the world based off the countries, these are your resources. They help a lot. Cool. So in this section, I'll be covering the fundamentals of what image analysis is, points of interest that we should be looking out for when analyzing images, and how this led to playing around with AI to identify bollards. So what I consider the core fundamentals of image analysis would be the context. So the context of an image could be anything from a news article to someone just sending you a picture of a cute dog in a park. It may not always necessarily be the best information to have around an image, but it's always the starting point, and in the end of the day, the context always matters. Then we have our image foreground and image background, which speaks for itself. Then we have our natural markers, which can be just rivers, mountains, anything that Mother Nature created for us to find. And then the intuition, also as I like to call it, your vibe meter. So for example, when I see this image, instantly the vibes are like Florence, Italy, and this is just largely due to playing a game called Assassin's Creed 2. The delusional version of myself also believes that I could climb this building, given I was a skilled assassin and had perfectly programmed handles, of course. But the point I'm trying to get across is that our brain is just like a web of information, and it tends to link information in really interesting ways. So since we have an intuition, you should use it. Here I've listed just a bunch of stuff as to what we should be looking out for in regards to image analysis, which I'll be doing a brief deep dive to some of them. So we have our driving side. It's a nice little picture, image, nice, of the driving sides in the world. So the right-hand driving sides are indicated in blue, and then left-hand driving countries are indicated in red. This is a very basic observation to make, but if, let's say, you get a left-hand driving country, there's a lot less that you should be looking around for, right? Then there's license plates. There are a ton of different license plates in the world, but having basic familiarity into identifying them can go a long way. So in GeoGuessr, license plates are blurred, which has created a new way of identifying them. So, for example, here we have an EU number plate or license plate, and this is dictated by the blue vertical stripe that we see. I hope you can see that. Anyways, we also then, accompanying that blue stripe, we have the yellow number plates in the front and the rear. Then you know you're in Netherlands or Luxembourg. And then in other Western countries of the world outside of the EU, such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US, have shorter but thicker license plates. Then we have bollards, which essentially are just different different road markings in different countries. For the most part, countries tend to have unique bollards for the most part, countries tend to have a distinct bollard. And it makes it really easy for us to find out where we are in a country based off the bollard, just because it's very common for countries to use them. So in the first image, we have a French bollard. We can also find this bollard in France with a red strip instead of the silver reflector strip, but those are the most common ones in France. Then we have a bollard that's most commonly found in Spain, and then I'm sure all of you have seen this following one. This is South Africa's bollard. And then lastly, for a bit of a more practical example, I was watching Instagram Reels, and I saw this downhill longboarding video, and instantly I spotted the bollard, which is most commonly found in Slovenia. So these are just kind of scratching the surface of hints to which country may be in. But yeah, so there's different sorts of things to look out for. So there's utility poles, street signs, even certain sidewalks can be an indication of where you are. But yeah, it's just all collectively just narrows down for a more educated guess. And then at this point in my geolocation journey, I was playing a lot of GeoGuessr. And ultimately, I was just fascinated with the idea of geolocation image analysis as a whole. So earlier this year, in May, we had SenseCon, which is like an internal company convention. And one of the days we were given 24 hours just to hack at an idea. So my idea, brilliant idea, was why don't we use AI to try and geolocate an image? That alone is a very big bite out of the AI pie. So it was decided to shrink this down to rather get a tool working to identify bollards instead. So before I continue, I would just like to make clear that I have very basic understanding when it comes to coding and little to none when it comes to AI. So I'm not going to be standing here to take credit for these scripts because I didn't write them. So all the credit will be going to the overlord itself, ChatGPT, which is ironic because I'm using AI to create an AI model. But yeah, so now that I've prefaced that, we can move on. The tool will just be, it comprises of 3 parts. It's the training script, it's the trained model, which is as a result of the training script, and then the predictor script, which actually makes the guess as to where the bollard belongs to. So I'm doing something very scary, and I am actually going to be doing a live demo. But now, with the screens doing this, I'm terrified. Okay, I'm going to need the USB. Thank you. Nice. Okay, so I have added comments to this code, 5-year-old worthy comments. But essentially, I'm just going to run through it so that whoever may know more than I do can figure it out. But no, so essentially, we just start off with defining the dimensions of the image input so that it is then resized for consistency. And then we classify the number of classes, which is distinguishing between 3 different types of bollards. In this case, it's 3 different countries. Then we initialize the sequential neural network, which is essentially just like a simplified computer digital brain, right? And then the sequential part means it's just stacking the layers in like a linear way. So then we start off with the convolutional layer, which applies 32 filters for feature extraction. Then we add a max pooling layer, which downsamples the feature maps and retains the essential information. Again, convolutional layer to increase the filters to capture more complexity. Continues downsampling, again, further increase filters, downsamples again. And then we flatten that 2D data into 1D, and this is needed for the dense layers. And then with the dense layers, it's a fully connected layer for classification, and then the output layer. Next, we just compile the model, specifying the optimizer, the loss function, and the metric monitor. And then it is specifying the directories containing our training and validation data sets. To note here, you do need to have different data sets per directory. So for your training data, you don't want it to be the same as your validation data, because if that's the case, it will just memorize your training data. So it will just be like, oh, I've seen this image, it's this. So instead of it memorizing that, you actually want it to have different data, even though it's about the same thing, just different angles and such. It's just to better generalize the AI ability. And then we have our batch size, which is just how many images it's using at once. I have it as 1 because my data set was very small. And then we implement the data augmentation to increase the data variety. This goes through a bunch of stuff. So for the training data specifically, it normalizes the pixel values. It then rotates the images randomly. It randomly shifts these images horizontally, then vertically. It applies shear transformation, randomly zooms into images, and then randomly flips these images horizontally. And then for the validation data set, it only normalizes the pixel data values. Then we load and augment and pre-process the training validation data. We determine the number of training steps per epoch, training the model using the augmented data and validate its performance. We train it for 100 epochs. Epochs are just like an iteration through the training data. And then we validate that model at the end of each epoch, and then we save that model. Cool. Then we go on to, no, that's a bollard. We go on to the predictor script. So for the top bit there, I've just added that in because it clutters your terminal if you don't. It just gives you a bunch of info messages when you run the tool, which for the demo, if you don't want. Then the tool sets up an argument parser to accept the path to an image for the command line. This was just added in for like usability, so we can add in -i to specify the path instead of hard coding it into the script. Then we load that pre-trained model from the training script. We define the dimensions of the input image it already expects. And then we map the numerical output to the country labels. So we have France, Slovenia, and South Africa. And then we load the input image and resize it to match the model's expected size again, convert the image to an array format suitable for processing, add an extra dimension to the array for batch size, normalize the pixel values to help the neural network process the data more efficiently and accurately. Then we use that model to predict the class of the product, of the bollard. Then we identify the class label with the highest predicted probability. It returns that corresponding country label, and then obviously it will use the image path provided to classify the bollard. Okay. So, yeah, okay. I'm just going to show you guys the test data that we're going to be using. So it's just 3 bollards. And then I'm going to one-hand this bad boy. Nope, there we go, already wrong. And then predict the script, -I, and then we add that France. Fingers crossed. Cool. And then we can do this for Slovenia. Nope, that's cool. 2 for 2. Let's go. And now, fingers crossed, for 3 for 3. Nice. Very cool. Okay. Sorry. There we go. Oh, all right. There we go. Okay. Alt F. Okay, cool. Finally, thank you. All right, so now that we've done that part, we had geolocation and chronolocation. So in this section, I'll be just running through locating some graffiti tags that you guys might recognize. We combine this with the skills that we learned from playing GeoGuessr, and then highlight the steps to manually validate an image that we got sent to us, claiming that it was from a said country. And then touching on the steps on how to also find out when an image was taken by turning an object into a sundial. Okay, cool. So, do any of you recognize this graffiti tag? Just raise your hands. Cool, cool. Nice, 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 nice. Awesome. So the ironic part of this photo is the sketchy penis enlargement ad, which just so happens to be a niche meta within South Africa. Fun fact. So a little bit of a history. Taps is an anonymous graffiti artist who's kind of made it his mission to put his tag wherever he sees fit. We've seen these tags on top of buildings, on train carts, etc. He just puts it essentially everywhere. So I thought it would be pretty fun to try and geolocate, well, pinpoint some of them. So a nice tool that we can utilize for this is Google Earth. A nice function within Google Earth is its 3D view. So if you zoom into any major city, it'll actually create like a nice 3D model of all the buildings. It can also do this sometimes for like touristy areas. So if there's big mountains, whatever, it will also do this for you, which is cool. So for the first tag, I've highlighted some points of interest that I think are important. We have very distinct 3 buildings there. We also have a very distinct bridge. Some of you may know what the bridge is. And then we also see a bunch of trains, which is cool. Trains are cool. Then as seen in the next image, this is in Google Earth. We find that bridge, we find those 3 buildings, we also find the trains, epic. And then we find that in Google Street View. Very cool. Then with the second tag, our points of interest is the ETV building, sick, and then the actual notch in the wall on the tab that the taps tag is actually on. And then as seen in the Google Earth screenshot, we find that building, but we can also actually see that notch within Google Earth, which is pretty cool detailing in my opinion. And then we find that tabs tag. And then lastly, for our third tag, our points of interest were the 3 buildings in front. We also see those trains again. Hell yeah, trains for the win. And then we also see a big tree, which is like something to note because we can see that tree in Google Earth as well as those buildings. And then we find that tabs tag. Cool. So now we take what we learned from GeoGuessr and we combine it with what we learned from pinpointing those tabs tags in order to manually validate an image. So in this example, our context is that someone sent us an image and they were just claiming that it was from Australia. I've highlighted some points of interest, being that phone number, the street sign, the traffic light, or robot, South African, come on, the driving side, license plate, and then a weird looking sculpture. So for the driving side and license plates, we see they're driving on the left-hand side. We also see that they are driving, or they have the short, thicker license plates. So if you remember, driving on the left-hand side can only be in a few countries, since it's also English-speaking, because if we go back, there's English on the signs. This narrows down our countries to only Australia, South Africa, Ireland, New Zealand, and the UK as a whole. And then but because of the license plates, we know that shorter, thicker license plates are usually found in Canada or America or New Zealand and Australia. So in this case, we can safely bring down, because it's driving on the left-hand side, paired with the English on the signs and the license plate, it's probably going to be in Australia or New Zealand. Then using GeoHints, we can see that Australia and New Zealand both have very similar looking traffic lights, which, yeah, nothing we can get from here, so we'll move on. Google's image reverse search is really smart. So if you throw an image in, it will actually highlight any text that it picks up. So we can just directly search that phone number, and we actually get a website with .co.nz TLD. So at this point, we can safely assume that we're probably in New Zealand. And then thanks again to Google or to GeoHints, we can see that New Zealand can actually be, major cities in New Zealand can actually be identified just by the street signs alone. So in this case, we do have that blue street sign with a white vertical strip. So now we know not only are we in New Zealand, but specifically in Christchurch. And the sign seems to read out Manchester Street. It's very blurry, so I've added a reference to kind of make up, what it is there. And then also, lastly, we have this weird sculpture, which isn't a crazy matter within GeoGuessr. It is just a very weird-looking sculpture, which is something we can look out for when we go to pinpointing. So in regards to pinpointing, we just started off with a simple Manchester Street, Christchurch, which we end up finding. Very cool. We also see that the road isn't that long, and we know that the photo was taken at an intersection, so it saves us quite a lot of time to only look around the few intersections that there are. We eventually come across in Google Street View that weird sculpture and also the nice little building that was behind it. And then eventually we pinpoint it. Very cool. All right. There are, however, a few more tools that we can utilize in further geolocation. So using image reverse search, we end up finding a news article which has that same photo, and it's also covers the big billow of smoke that we have in that photo. The news article mentions a fire that erupted in a suburb in Christchurch, or at a wastewater treatment plant more specifically, but the key or noteworthy information that we can take from this news article, there we go, is that it's from, or the suburb is called Bromley, and yeah, basically the suburb is called Bromley. That is all I remember. But we also get to see the structure that was actually on fire. So next we'll look on to see if we can find that structure. Bromley is pretty far from the initial location that we found, or that we had. So our next step could be to look through Bromley in Google Street View, but this would take a lot of time and would just be a waste. So since we have a decent idea of how that structure looks, we can utilize Google Earth once more. So indicated by the yellow pin is our initial image location. Bromley sits about southeast from that image location, and because of that smoke cloud that we saw earlier, it's not going that way, it's going that way. So it sits more in the northeast. So I just used the line tool to just make a rough line as to use as a reference for where I can start scanning. Eventually, we do see something that looks very similar to the structures that we saw. And then upon close inspection, these do look very damaged. And then we can actually utilize the ability to go back in time to see that they were perfectly fine in 2019. So these are for sure the buildings that were on fire. And we have validated that. Okay, so now that we've covered how we can find out where to find images, we can also move on to how we can find out when an image was taken. So to do this, we follow the next steps, which is we need context around the image. So if we can see if we can identify any clues as to when and where an image was taken. So with where, obviously this means we need to just geolocate our image. And then with when, we'll be doing a shadow calculation by turning an object into a sundial. So here we have a picture of Nelson Mandela, specifically a statue, not him. At this point, we can find out quite easily where this image was taken, but if we wanted to find out when this image was taken, how would we do this? So we would do this by turning the statue into a sundial, as mentioned. I'll be going through those processes and then detail the steps as to how we can do this. So first, we need to require some context. As seen previously, we can look at doing this with an image reverse search. So already we get a big hint as to where we are. And then after clicking on the Find Image Source button, we get to see, it looks like our image, but also 2 hits from the timvp.com website. Lucky us, when we go there, not only do we find our initial image, we also find the day it was taken. We also find out that it was taken before lunchtime because they mentioned that they went to the Rocker restaurant next door after they had their little visit. So now that we know which day it was taken, April 24th, where the image was taken, which is the Drakensberg prison, and that we can actually now try and narrow down what time this image was taken. So to do this, we need to make a sundial, and for that we need 4 variables. So we need the height of the object, we also need the length of its casted shadow, and then we need the azimuth, which is the direction of the sunlight, and then we need the altitude of the shadow as well. So for the heights of the object, first we need to figure out how tall the statue is. Google. 3.2 meters, very nice, cool. Since we've also already geolocated our image, we can move over to Google Earth and place a pin down. And then I tend to just make a boundary box for my area. It's not necessarily needed, but it just helps when making your shadow line. Then next, I've added a shadow line to where I roughly think the shadow ends. It takes a while. I'll be honest, it's not the easiest thing to do, but when you do your shadow line, you can then use the ruler function to measure that. So then the ground length actually is 4.99 meters. Very cool. And then we need our azimuth. So with the next variable, we need to figure out we need to first draw a sun line. So since the sun is always perpendicular to the shadow, this is quite easy to do. So we just add our sun line, and then to get our azimuth, we use the ruler function again, but this time we take note of the degrees, and that would be our azimuth. Then we move over to our altitude. Thanks to trigonometry, we can utilize the fact that we already know the height of the object and the length of its shadow. Since I dropped out of high school, I'm using a trigonometry calculator where we added the values in for A, which is the height of the object, and then B, which is the length of shadow, and then we hit calculate, and then we get our angle A, that's the altitude. And then now that we all have our sundial values, I've made a nice diagram to make it look like a cool sundial, but we now can populate SunCal. So since we already know where our image location is, we can just right-click on that pin and view its properties, which we then see our latitude and longitude. We then add our details into sundial, so we add our longitude and latitude. We then add our object label as well. It's the only ones that we can add in, and then obviously the date that that photo was taken. This is obviously important because the sun moves dependent on the day and which season you're in, so it's always good to know when exactly that image was taken. And then lastly, we just move that dial around until we match it up with our altitude and azimuth and shadow length values. It's not always exactly the same values, but it's just about one off here and there, so overall not too bad. So we can safely assume that the photo was taken around 10:23 a.m., which kind of checks out because the photo was taken before lunch, so pretty cool. So in this last section, I'll be highlighting some key takeaways and some examples of how we can use this for good. So I hope the talk emphasizes that we should be considerate over what we post online. We should also manually validate what we come across, the power of geolocation, how we can find out not only when or where an image was taken, but also when. And then, more importantly, the ethical considerations and humanitarian work that we could actually do with this. So there's an extensive amount of work that can be done with geolocation, and this ranges from locating terrorist compounds or to finding missing people. In a world where human rights are challenged on a daily basis, people like you and me can do a lot more than what we may think. So, for example, here I've added Benjamin Strick's website, which is also a big tribute to how I know the things I know. He's a digital investigator who has done a ton of humanitarian work, but he also does tutorials on the stuff that I've been speaking about today, which are awesome, and I highly recommend that you guys watch them. I do, however, just want to give a bit of a warning. With the work that he does, it is obviously a bit hard to watch sometimes because it's not the nicest parts of the world, that we see here. So, for example, he's done a case study where a plane was shot down in Ethiopia. And then another example, which was a bit harder, he did a documentary detailing the steps he took to find out where, when, and who was responsible for brutally executing 2 women and 2 children in Cameroon. I am sorry for closing this off with a bit of a downer, but it is more so just to try and reinforce that even though we're just behind a laptop screen, we can do a lot more than what we may think. So yeah, thank you.